the lesson for us, I think, even today in the world is where we see conflict, where we see societal breakdown, where we see, mental health breakdown, all of these kinds of things, we need to look and see like, okay, where are the weaknesses? What are the things that are revealed by those kinds of experiences, and how can we perhaps adapt and change and grow and be able to find a way to overcome some of those problems as they are revealed. Well, hello and welcome to The Golden Thread. I want to start today by asking a question, and that is, have you ever had an experience that revealed something to you about yourself that was valuable? I can think of many of these kinds of experiences in my own life. A lot of times these can be the sorts of experiences that we tend to want to avoid. So experiences like conflict and struggle and even some measure of catastrophe. These are the kinds of experiences oftentimes that reveal to us the most about ourselves. And by having those things revealed, we can actually learn to be able to adapt and change and grow as a result of those experiences. I was thinking about some of those kinds of experiences in my own life, and one that came to mind was an instance where my wife and I, we had just bought our first house, and so we were going about the process of beginning to furnish the house. And so again, this was our first house, and so for the most part, we were getting things from yard sales and trying to cut costs and cut corners as much as possible. And so we had picked up a couple of couches from a yard sale, and so we were borrowing my father-in-law's pickup truck. So my father-in-law had this red pickup truck that was like, beautiful, right? Not a spot on it, not a scratch, not a ding or a dent. And my father-in-law is the kind of guy where, he keeps his things, very nice, and he's very fastidious and very careful with his stuff. So we borrowed this pickup truck and we're using it to cart things around. And so we had these two couches. And so I went to pick up these couches and was loading one of the couches into the back of the pickup truck with some help. And so we were doing this. And as we're loading this couch into the back of the pickup truck, we're, just pushing it in the last kind of few inches or so. And so we give it this one final push. And then as we do this, I hear the worst sound in the world. And you know what it is, right? It's the sound of breaking glass. And so, I hear the sound and I'm like, my heart, just sinks in my chest, just goes down through the ground. And so I stop and I go around, and sure enough, what we've done is we've pushed the arm of the couch into the rear window of the truck cab, and it has shattered the glass of the cab of my father-in-law's perfect, spotless red pickup truck. And it was like one of those like surreal moments, that you have where time just stops, right? Like the world just slows down and everybody's like mouth is moving, but you don't hear any sound. It's just, you're just like in this kind of fugue state. And I don't know how long that went on for some time, but it was like my life passed before my eyes. I'm like, oh no. And so after I had recovered from the immediate shock of the experience, I went and of course I had to tell my wife that this had happened. So I go in and she's sitting there and she looks up and she sees my face, and immediately she looks scared. She's like, "Oh my gosh, like what happened? Did somebody die? Like what happened?" Like, and and so I say, to her, it's like, no, nobody's passed away. It's much worse. it's your dad's pickup truck. And so I explained to her what happened. And it's so funny because she like breathes a sigh of relief and she's like, oh my gosh, like she's like, I thought something really terrible happened. I'm like, and I said to her, I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, this is the worst possible thing in the world that could happen. I'd rather, have something, I'd rather have been hit by a pickup truck myself than to have to. Now I have to go and you understand, I have to go and I have to tell your dad that I broke his pickup truck. And it's funny because, she obviously wasn't happy about it either, but she was just very surprised by like how I took it. Like, to me, it was like the worst thing imaginable. And let me fast forward, to the end of the story. Spoiler alert, I did eventually work up the courage to go and tell him, and no, he didn't, take my head off with a chainsaw or anything like that. He was actually pretty cool about it. And, and then, insurance paid for it and all the rest. And so it worked out. Though I will say I have never borrowed that pickup truck ever since, nor will I, not after that experience. But what that experience showed me, and was kind of interesting, like after having had the experience and having reflected on it a little bit, like this experience, as awful as it was for me anyway, like it's funny to tell the story now, but in the moment it was like, oh my gosh, this is the most traumatic thing in the world. But what it did is it revealed certain things to me about myself. Like I started to understand that, like, not everybody is affected the same way by these kinds of experiences. And like for my wife, it was like, oh yeah, these things happen. It's terrible, but like, what are you going to do? No big deal. For me, it was like world destroying. It was like the worst possible thing imaginable. And what I learned about myself from that experience is that it revealed a certain weakness that I have, or a certain penchant that I have for making. It revealed something to me about the way that I feel about making mistakes, particularly when it comes to making mistakes that impact other people, that might cause another person harm or expense or inconvenience, and particularly when it comes to maybe making a mistake that does all of that when it comes to a person that, I'm trying to impress, that I'm trying to not look like an idiot in front of. So in this case, my father-in-law, here I am. I'm trying to, show that I'm like not a moron. And here I go, destroying his precious truck. And so what it revealed to me was, it revealed this thing that no doubt goes back to past experiences and stuff like that. And so because I had that experience, as difficult as it was to go through, I learned this about myself. And this has actually been helpful for me in being able to grow from that experience, to be able to consider the way in which I view mistakes that get made and the inevitable kinds of catastrophes that sometimes do come about because of human error and all the rest. And it helps me to understand a little bit of where I'm coming from with that, and maybe not react or notice when I'm starting to react in those kinds of ways. And so this is just one example of a way in which a bad experience or a conflict or a struggle of some kind or a catastrophe of some kind can reveal to us things about ourselves that allow for the possibility of transformation. They allow for us to be able to change and to grow and to rise to be something greater than ourselves. And this idea, this concept, is a concept that we see time and time again in stories, right? If we think about all of the great stories, the hero tales and so forth, the hero has to go through all kinds of struggle. The hero has to go through all kinds of conflict, sometimes external, sometimes internal, that many times reveals things that allow the hero to be able to grow and overcome and to rise and become greater as a result of that experience. The heroic story is a story about transformation, about being changed by the kinds of struggles that we face. And if we kind of play that outward, if we scale that upwards, we also see this as being true not just on the individual level, but on the macro level, on the cultural level, right? We see oftentimes stories or even experiences in the world around us where what happens on the individual level, this kind of this kind of struggle that we go through on the individual level scales upward and actually is what we go through as a culture as well. And so, like, for example, one such story that is one of the great timeless stories, one of the ones that goes way back, all the way back to Homer, is the story of the Iliad. And the Iliad is a tale, along with its companion piece, the Odyssey, which we will also talk about at some point in the future as well. The Iliad is a story about struggle. It's about struggle. It's about conflict. It's about what conflict can reveal to us about ourselves and about our culture. In a lot of ways, the Iliad is the story about what happens when we don't realize some of the things that are going on, and then also about how we can overcome even in the midst of that. It's a story about transformation, and it's a story about the downfall of civilization. And then, just to give a little tease towards the Odyssey is sort of the other side of that same story. It's kind of the flip side of the coin of how we can then return home, about how civilization, about how culture can be restored even on the other side of catastrophe. So the Iliad, as we're thinking about this here today, is a story about conflict and about what can be revealed to us through conflict. And so what is the story of the Iliad? I want to just take a few minutes to talk about it here. And so for those who may be less familiar, the story of the Iliad is the story of the Trojan War. And the Trojan War arises, this grand scale conflict, right? Because we think about what war is. War is conflict playing out on the most macro level. And so the Trojan War arises out of internal individual conflict. It's actually a conflict between two men, and those are Menelaus, the king of Sparta, and Paris, who's the prince of Troy, and they are, of course, fighting, as all too often is the case. They're fighting over a woman who is the famous Helen, the famous Helen, who is beautiful and is said to have had the face that launched 1,000 ships, right? And what that is, of course, in reference to is that Paris becomes enamored with Helen, the wife of Menelaus, and so he carries her off with him and takes her back to Troy. And of course, Menelaus is enraged by this, and so he gathers together all of the many heroes and kings and lords and people of Greece, and all of these city-states and these tribes. They band together and they form this massive armada, this great golden fleet of ships that sails across the sea, across the Aegean, to go and besiege Troy, to make war on the Trojans, and to bring Helen back home. And so this is the image that we see at the beginning of the stories, this fleet of ships out on the sea. And so I just want you to imagine this fleet of ships sailing out, and it's this image of this golden fleet and all of these generals and all of these heroes in their armor, and they're out there on their ships, and the sails are, they're in full sail, and they're going out across the sea. And there is this sense in which in the midst of all this pomp and splendor, there's this sort of assumption that this war is going to be over in no time, right? Like the Trojans don't stand a chance. This is the might of a unified Greece, of all of these mighty kings and warriors and their armies coming together to make war on the Trojans. And so it's going to be a quick, easy conflict. We're going to go over there. We're going to take the city. We're going to bring back Helen, and it's going to be a great victory and a great feather in the cap of Greece. Except, of course, for those who know the story, this isn't what happens. What instead happens is they sail their ships, they land, the conflict begins, and it's like from then on out, all hell breaks loose. Like everything goes wrong, and everything imaginable goes wrong, and the conflict drags on and on and on and on, and it ends up going on for 10 years. In a lot of ways, the Trojan War is sort of the archetype that in a lot of ways, it's like the Vietnam Vietnam of the ancient world, right? It's this war that's like, oh, it's going to be easy. It's going to be no problem. We'll just go and do this thing. And then it becomes this embroilment that just drags on and on and on and on. And the reason why, what's interesting about this and what's so fascinating in the story is the reason why it drags on and on. Like the reason why this struggle becomes this unending cycle of misery. And it's because of the division between the leaders of the Greek army. That all of these men, all of these heroes and so forth, with their armies and their warriors and their ships and so forth, they also come with egos, and they rub each other the wrong way over and over again. And they are constantly getting into these kinds of squabbles and skirmishes amongst themselves. We even see in the story, there's Homer gives us this kind of like peek behind the curtain where we get to see the gods, and the gods are like behind the scenes, and they're like pulling strings, right? They're playing favorites, and this one, is favors, Odysseus, and this one favors Achilles, and this one favors Agamemnon, and so forth. And they all have their like, kind of favorite team that they're sort of rooting for. And so it becomes, so on the surface, it's this very natural kind of conflict that's going on, this very political sort of struggle, but behind the scenes there's this like spiritual civil war that's going on like underneath, and that's what's driving things, that's what's fueling things, and it's individuals, it's what's going on in the hearts of these men and the struggles between them. And there's this passage where we see a description of what it looks like as the Greeks are descending upon the fields of battle. And so we have this image of the ships, and then we have this image of tents assembling, and it says that they're like leaves. They're like leaves scattered across these fields of the Scamander. And that image of leaves, the image of tents, the image of ships, they're all really kind of evoking the same sort of idea, which is this image of something that at a distance looks unified, right? The armada of ships, it all looks like it's one thing that's all kind of sailing together off to battle in this way, or all of these tents and all of this entire army, or the leaves of a tree that all look unified together. Except here's the thing about all of them, they're not actually unified, right? A gust of wind could come and blow those leaves away. It could blow the tents or blow the ships, and the ships could be scattered, right? They could separate from one another and begin to fragment and begin to disperse across the water, or the leaves could be blown away across the plain. That's the image of unity, something that looks unified at a distance, but when you actually get close, you see that there's all this kind of fragmentation. There's all these things that are actually the potentials for division. And what the conflict with the Trojans reveals to the Greeks is it reveals divisions that are already there. Right? It reveals weaknesses. It reveals this sort of this weakness about the Greek civilization, which is that it is fraught with division. It is fraught with conflict. It is fraught with ego. There's all of these different powers that are playing against each other. And what looks unified from a distance, what looks like this golden armada of Greece that is so powerful, is actually fragmented, that there's all these little fragmentations, and what it takes is a conflict. It takes the battle, it takes the experience, the catastrophe of war to reveal the weakness that is already there. And a lot of times, we look at these kinds of things, we look at conflicts and we look at catastrophe and all of those sorts of things, and we look at them in a negative light. We think, oh, this is such a terrible thing, and in a lot of times it is. But what I want to talk about and what I want to kind of focus on here today is that there's actually an opportunity there, that there's an opportunity that wherever we see conflict, wherever we see struggle and division and disunity and all of those kinds of things happening, that there is an opportunity to understand something about what's going on beneath the surface. And this is the case for the Trojans, or this is the case for the Greeks in the Trojan Wars, that they begin to realize this about themselves. And so in a lot of ways, what is the story of like the downfall of Troy is actually the story of the downfall of Greece, even though spoiler alert, the Greeks are the ones that win the war. What we start to see is, oh, these are the things that are actually plaguing that civilization. And I think it's the kinds of things that we actually see happening in the world today as well. That as we look at the modern world, as we look at our own experience here in the modern world, particularly here in the West, in the Western civilization, you look at Western civilization and there's so much about it that looks powerful and unified and golden and glorious and all of those kinds of things. And there are things about the modern world that are truly momentous and incredible, but at the same time, there's also conflict. And I think that in the conflict, and as we're seeing conflict grow, I think we've seen a lot more conflict growing over the past few decades, this sense of cultural unraveling, this sense of unrest and uneasiness. There's war in various places and societal upheavals and political struggles and all of these kinds of things that just seem to be intensifying, that we can look at those things and we could say, wow, this is really, terrible on the one hand, but on another level, that there's an opportunity for us to see something about ourselves, that there's an opportunity for something to be revealed to us about what's actually going on beneath the surface. If we're capable of looking a little bit deeper and seeing, okay, so what is this actually revealing to us? And I think that what we see it revealing is very similar to what was revealed to the Greeks by the Trojan War, which was this kind of fragmentation beneath the surface, that there was this division, that there was this conflict that went underneath, that had gone overlooked for a long time, but that conflict began to bring to the surface. And so I want to just share with you some statistics about some research that's been done over the last decade or two regarding some of the division that we see even here in the modern world in the West. One of the ways that we see this manifesting in the modern world is in the political realm. The Pew Research Center did a study in 2014 that revealed that partisan animosity has increased substantially over the past 2 decades, that those who had a negative view of the opposing party had more than doubled since 1994. And most of these folks believed that the opposing party's politics, quote, were so misguided that they threatened the nation's well-being. And again, that was a poll from 2014. And then we see a poll taken 10 years later in 2024, a Gallup poll that showed that a record high of 80% of adults in the U.S. believe that Americans are greatly divided on the most important values, which had ticked up 77% from the last time that they had asked the question in 2016. And so we see this kind of partisan animosity. We see division in the political sphere, increasing and ratcheting up over the decades, particularly in the United States. And so this is just like this will be one outward expression of the way that we're seeing division and fragmentation and polarization in our culture today. But the other thing that is really fascinating that we can learn from the story of the Trojan War in the Iliad is that these kind of outward expressions of fragmentation, right, the kinds of conflict and divisions that we see in the political sphere and in the societal sphere, that these are things that actually manifest themselves outward from an inward source. That in the story of the Trojan War, we see this conflict taking place between the Trojans and the Greeks, but ultimately it goes back to 2 men, right? Like it goes back to these 2 guys fighting over a girl, right? And it goes back to ego, and it goes back to this kind of interpersonal struggle. Similarly, as the story unfolds itself, we see divisions and breakdown of communication and breakdown of cooperation between the different Greek tribes, and it again goes back to ego. We see a struggle between the great hero Achilles and Agamemnon, who is one of the kings, and so they become embroiled in this conflict with one another, and it's the same thing over again. They're fighting over a girl, but it's really that Achilles' pride has been hurt. His pride has been injured, and so he refuses to fight. He won't go out and fight with them, and so instead they start to fight and start to bicker with one another, and chaos ensues, and the Trojans begin to win the war. And it all goes back to this internal struggle of like what's going on the inside. In fact, there's a passage in the story where it talks about, it says, "Sing, O goddess, the anger of Achilles," or the rage of Achilles that brings many ills upon the people. So it's this idea that the anger of what's going on internally, the psychological fragmentation, the breakdown internally in an individual will manifest itself outward and eventually result in societal breakdown as well. And I think that that is also a key to understanding what we're seeing even on the modern landscape. And so once again, just to look at some of the statistics of this, we're thinking about mental health, right? There is happening, even today, what many people have referred to as a mental health crisis. And so some of the statistics that we see are the American Psychiatric Association did a study where from 2005 to 2017, and from 2008 to 2017 in adolescents and in adults, we saw that there was a major uptick in the rates of individuals reporting symptoms of depressive disorders and anxiety disorders, increasing 52% in adolescents and 63% in young adults. The Pew Research Center corroborates this with a study that they did in 2023. So sometime later, a poll of American high school students that were collected since 2011, and the data in 2021 was that 40% of the people polled, quote, experienced persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness, which was up 28% from when the study was started. Once again, in recent years, in 2022 as well, there was a study done. CNN conducted a poll where they found that 9 out of 10 adults that they interviewed said that they believe that there's a mental health crisis in the United States today. And so we see these kinds of statistics, and we see that there is something going on in the mental health sphere, right? That this is something that there's some kind of breakdown going on in terms of anxiety and depression and some of these other disorders that we see going on. And I believe that what we can learn from the story of the Iliad is that these things don't happen in a vacuum, right? That it's actually that there's this kind of cyclical nature to it, that the fragmentation that goes on the inside of people psychologically manifests itself outward and results in breakdown in the culture. And so I think a lot of the cultural breakdown that we're seeing is an outward extension, an outward manifestation of the inward breakdown that's going on the inside. But I think it also flows the other way too. It goes out from the out to the in as well, that we live in a culture, we live in a society with frameworks and structures that enable us to maintain our psychological stability. And so what we see happening is when the culture around us, when those structures begin to break down, that begins to break down the framework of our own psychological stability. And so some of the mental health things that we have going on are breaking down because of the societal breakdown around us. And so we see it's this kind of death spiral of these things going round and round like this. And we can learn this. And again, this is not a new pattern. This is a pattern that has manifested itself, again, for eons. And we see it being told time and time again in the stories that we are experiencing. But there's an opportunity here, right? Like when we see this kind of breakdown happening, when we see these kinds of conflicts erupting, it allows us to be able to start turning the introspective light on and begin to ask the questions like, where is this coming from? Like, why are we seeing some of this happening? Like, it reveals the cracks in the armor, so to speak, right? It reveals the things that when things are going well and everything is pleasant and everything is peaceful, we don't see the potential danger that is there. And it's actually the hidden weakness that is the most dangerous. This is another thing that we can learn from the story of the Iliad, because once again, one of the major players in this story is Achilles, right? So Achilles is this heroic character. He's this powerful warrior. In many ways, he is essentially invincible, and he sees himself that way. He sees himself as invincible. When he's a baby, the story goes that his mother dipped him in the river of death and brings him back out. And so that he can never be killed. He is impervious to wound and to death. But when she dipped him in the river, she had to hold him by his heel. And so this is where we get of course, the famous idiom, the Achilles heel. The one place that he was not protected is his heel. And it's a little bit ambiguous, I think, in the story as to whether or not Achilles knows that he has this weakness, because he acts like he doesn't know that this is even the case. And if he does know that it's the case, he just completely overlooks it. He treats himself, he acts as if he himself is invincible. And he has that kind of arrogance as a result. And we too, I think here in the West, by and large, have seen ourselves as being this sort of invincible force in the world. And many times, even personally, we can look at ourselves and we can have this sort of, as we live in an affluent culture and as we live in a time where there's so much power and potential at our fingertips all the time, we can treat ourselves as if we were invincible. But it is the hidden weakness that is the most deadly, because, of course, we know from the story that the Achilles heel comes back to haunt Achilles. And so as he's out there in the battle, a stray arrow, a poisoned dart hits him in the heel and he is killed. And it's his arrogance that kills him. It's his refusal to look within and to see the weakness and to take precautions and to take measures to deal with the problem that is there. He just wants to deny that it's there. And so the lesson for us, I think, even today in the world, is where we see conflict, where we see societal breakdown, where we see, mental health breakdown, all of these kinds of things, we need to look and see, like, okay, where are the weaknesses? What are the things that are revealed by those kinds of experiences, and how can we perhaps adapt and change and grow and be able to find a way to overcome some of those problems as they are revealed. The other choice is to deny their existence whatsoever. It's to just pretend that we can just go on as we are. And we see in the case of Achilles that ultimately leads to his destruction. But ironically, and this is at the end of the story of the Iliad, and I would encourage you to read it yourself and to be able to draw a lot more things from it. But at the end of the story, what we actually see is that the death of Achilles, in an ironic way, is actually what brings the Greeks together at the end, because it wakes them up and it causes them to realize that they'd been fighting amongst themselves. They've been fighting one another, and suddenly they come to the realization, oh, we actually have a common adversary here. Like, we're here not to fight one another. We're here to fight the Trojans. We're here to fight the enemy. And so they're able to unify against this one single common adversary. And I think that we see this kind of pattern happening in the modern world as well, that as people become more and more aware of the kind of societal breakdown and fragmentation that we are experiencing as a culture, that there is more and more this sort of call to arms. You know what I'm talking about? Like, it's this sort of sense of, like, we've got to identify the enemy, right? Like, we've got to identify the adversary. And there's this instinctive sort of sense of, like, okay, if we've lost something that's unified us as a culture in a positive sense, maybe we can unify in a negative sense against an adversary. And this is a very, very dangerous thing, right? Because this is an instinct that can be manipulated. This is an instinct that can be used to do exactly what happens to the Greeks, exactly what the Trojans ultimately do to the Greeks, which is to turn them against one another. And if we allow ourselves to be kind of manipulated and pulled into this idea of, like, finding the enemy amongst ourselves, we will just constantly be tearing ourselves apart, which is what the Greeks do. But in the end, they're able to unify and they're able to win the war. How? Because they're able to realize that there is an actually greater adversary that is greater than all of these little conflicts. And I think that is an opportunity for us too here in the modern world, is to ask the question of, is there actually, like, a single adversary? Is there actually something that is causing this societal breakdown? Is there something that's actually causing this kind of fragmentation? Something that is greater than, the kind of partisan struggle and warfare that we see in our culture of, oh, it's this political group, or, oh, it's this ethnic group, or, oh, it's this policy, or, oh, it's this, societal issue. And these all may be issues. And we'll talk about some of these issues in later episodes as well. But, like, we need to ask ourselves the question of, like, is there something greater? Is there something bigger than that we can actually unify behind and unify against? And so I think that that's something that's worth considering, because I think that we do start to see, like, where we see this kind of widespread breakdown, I think that what it reveals is that there may be something at the bottom of all that. And that image, that idea of something like from the bottom coming up and pulling us down, is like the image of a monster, right? It's the image of a sea serpent. It's the image of the kraken, of the beast that comes up from underneath. And to go back to that image of ships again, right? Like, if our culture is this armada that's sailing into the future, that's sailing into the unknown, that's sailing off into the adventure, and we're starting to find that the ships are fragmenting and are starting to splinter apart, and people are going into the water, and it's becoming overwhelming, and it's stormy, and there's waves. The question kind of needs to be, like, first of all, is there something that's kind of pulling at us from underneath? And, like, what might that thing be? Can we begin to unify ourselves actually against whatever that thing is? And also, is there a way of pulling us back together? Is there a way of unifying the ships back together again? Like, the people that are in the water, the ones that are floating, can we throw them a lifeline? Is there a way that we can kind of pull things back together? And I think that this is the image, and this is the first kind of way that we'll evoke this image of the idea of the golden thread, the idea that there could be a lifeline, that there could be a common thread that you can unite all of us. And I think it's to be found in stories. I think it's to be found in some of these ancient stories like the Iliad that we're referring to here today. And we'll talk more about maybe some of the ways in which it can be found. But maybe the first clue is, what is it that is kind of beginning to pull us apart, and how do we begin to draw ourselves back together again? Of course, at the end of the story of the Trojan War, that's exactly what the Greeks do. They return to the ships, and instead of each of them sailing off in different directions, they actually break the ships down. They build them together into the famous Trojan horse, which becomes, of course, the way in which they take the city and get the victory. And so there's this idea of breaking down the barriers, breaking down the things that are separating us, unifying us into a single force that can work together for a common good. And so what I want to just leave us with here is, what thoughts what thoughts come to you from the story of the Iliad? We've just talked about it very briefly here, but when we think about this image of fragmentation and breakdown, where do we maybe see some of those things happening in our culture? And are there ways in which we can kind of push back against the tendency of us to want to fight against one another and push against one another and kind of fall back into this sort of tribalism? Is there a way in which that we can experience more unity here? What are some of the experiences that we've even had in our own lives? What are some experiences even personally where we've maybe gone through some struggle or some difficulty or some conflict and ultimately came out on the other side with a revelation of what is it in ourselves that that might require transformation? What are some things that we begin to learn about ourselves, see about ourselves individually, culturally, that might enable us to give us some clues as to where we might begin to change? And so I want to leave you with some of those thoughts. So maybe consider that, maybe talk about it respectfully in the comments. And once again, we want to think about the ways in which we can come together to work towards unity and to resist the temptation to be pulled apart and to be broken down into the kind of fragmentation that we see all too often in the world today. And so again, I want to leave you with that as an opportunity. And so I look forward to getting to interact with you in the comments, and I look forward to seeing you again soon in the next episode.